would actually give some greetings to this event. First and foremost, Ambassador Aharon Leshno-Yaar. He was appointed Ambassador of Israel to the European Union and NATO in 2016. Before his current position, he was the Ambassador of Israel to the UN in Geneva from 2008 to 2012. And he served in several prestigious positions within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Ambassador Leshno-Yaar, thanks for joining us. Please unmute, the floor is yours. Ambassador, you're on mute.
Okay, do you hear me now?
Perfectly.
Great, so Stevie, thank you very much for inviting me to the inaugural event of Yata Israel. Good afternoon to you all from Brussels. As you may know, the mission of Israel to the EU is also the mission to NATO. I am the ambassador accredited to the alliance, and I have here with me a strong team staffing our office in NATO headquarters and meeting daily NATO officials and diplomats. Indeed, in the last 5 years, we witnessed a significant increase in joint Israel-NATO activities in many formal and informal ways. For the first time, we have a formal work plan that recently was extended until 2023. An Israeli military attaché moved his office from The Hague to Brussels, and Israeli experts are invited to take part in important and exclusive NATO working groups, just to give you a test of the kind of engagement that we have currently with NATO. Every point of engagement between NATO and Israeli counterparts is a welcome development, and I warmly welcome the establishment of a Yata chapter in Israel. It is a good opportunity to create close dialogue between interested Israelis and colleagues from allies and partner countries, as well as NATO secretariats. I hope that Yata Israel will engage in a fruitful discussion with your partners on ideas and tools to tackle existing and emerging challenges, and together brainstorm ideas for possible solutions. This is what we are also doing with our NATO partners. Israel is bringing to the NATO table our unique geostrategic location, combined with our past, present, and future challenges and operational and technological solutions, which we routinely share with our NATO partners. From my experience, I can say that often Israel's challenges today will become challenges tomorrow of NATO, and Israel's solutions today may be useful for NATO allies tomorrow and even today. Examples are many, from counter-terrorism, and especially the challenge of non-state actors using civilians as a cover or hijacking state institutions to legitimize their operations. We have more than one example in our immediate neighborhood, to new and emerging technologies, to resilience, and many more issues that both Israel and NATO are discussing, sharing best practices, battlefield experience, and different types of solutions. One important element in our discussion with NATO in recent months, which I especially favor, is around Israel's new set of relations with Arab countries, and whether NATO could benefit from the new reality in the Middle East. I have no doubt that the answer to this almost rhetorical question is positive. And indeed, we are encouraging NATO to explore ways and means to increase its engagement with Israel and its Arab partners, old and new, for the benefit of the alliance. As far as my NATO team is concerned, we are happy to continue supporting and working with Yata Israel for the benefit of Israel-NATO relations. I wish all of you a productive discussion, and to the organizers, much success in promoting Yata Israel activities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for your leadership and your friendship and your help also in establishing Yata in Israel and what you do for Israel and Euro-Atlantic relationship. I move now to my phone due to tech problem, a year and a half in COVID-19. We still have some tech problems here and there. I hope you can still hear me. Our next greeter and speaker is Mr. James Townsend, Jr. He was elected as the president of ATA in July 2020. He's a senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security, where he co-hosts a weekly podcast called Brussels Sprouts. As a Belgian, I have to say that I really like the name. As of 2017, Mr. Townsend has completed 8 years as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for European and NATO policy. Mr. Townsend, the floor is yours.
Well, hello to all of the participants in this, what I have to say is quite an incredible Yata presentation today. It's with great appreciation that you invited me to take part in this. And what I'd like to say, and I realize we're certainly short of time, we've got a very important panel coming up. As the president of the Atlantic Treaty Association, we are embarked on a major reform of the ATA. I'm sure the ATA Israel chapter has received updates and information on the new future that we see for the ATA, a much stronger relationship between the chapters and with NATO. And I'm really looking forward to working closely with the ATA chapter in Israel to try to help, and what the ambassador just said about the Israeli NATO relationship, to make sure that we do everything we can as an ATA chapter and as the ATA organization, that we do everything we can to make sure that that relationship between Israel and NATO is close. I spent years working at NATO. I spent even more years working at the Pentagon on Europe and NATO relations. And I know how important Israel is both to the United States and to NATO. I know about the neighborhood in which Israel exists and how important it is that we remain very close and we work in such a cooperative and forward-looking way. And so on behalf of the Atlantic Treaty Association, all 38 or so chapters around Europe and North America, I say to the Israeli ATA chapter, we look forward to working even more closely with you into the future and helping bring about what the ambassador just referred to in terms of the Israeli-NATO relationship. But especially today, we're here to applaud the Yata chapter, which is just opened within the Israeli ATA. And I have to say, having worked with Yata now quite a bit, Yata is the engine of the ATA. Yata is the engine, it's the ingenuity, it is the future. It is the energy that drives what we all need to be doing as chapters as we work together and as we work with NATO. And so was so glad to hear that a very strong Yata chapter has now opened in Israel, and that will be the engine for the Israeli ATA as well. And so I know Gina, who will follow me, who's the president of Yata, will echo certainly all the welcome remarks from the Yata chapters across the ATA. So let me just sum up by saying that my heart is full working with the Israel ATA chapter, and I am just as excited as I'm sure the Yata is about a new chapter being birthed in Israel. And I am happy to work with that Yata chapter as well as the ATA chapter at any time coming up to make sure that that we bring the strength of the ATA together to help boost both the new Yata chapter as well as the Israeli ATA. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jim. And we're looking forward to working under your leadership and Gina's leadership to foster the transatlantic bond and the values embedded in the North Atlantic Treaty, the value of democracy, freedom, liberty, peace, security, and the rule of law. And last, but definitely not least, I'm pleased to introduce Dina Gjoni, the president of the Youth Atlantic Treaty Association. Gina works as well as in the Ministry of Environment in the Republic of Albania, and she worked at the European University of Tirana as a professor assistant at the Department of International Relations. Gina, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the International Institute for Counter-Terrorism, Yata Israel, and mostly the newest created Yata chapter, Yata Israel. And I'm very pleased to be in this inaugural event of Yata Israel. And when I took the invitation, I was going to prepare my remarks, and I was going through and really like to share with you a quote for the event. Terrorism robs young people of their lives and opportunities, of their present and their future. Youth, therefore, has as much a stake as anyone in counter-terrorism. We need practical and innovative ways to help them rise and address their concerns and safeguard their peers and communities. In fact, I will directly go to my remarks and say that despite the fact that the youth are generally much better, let's say, positions to promote a culture of tolerance, diversity, and peace, interreligious dialogue amongst each other, the young generation is the same targeted by terrorism. And nonetheless, the youth efforts to communicate, engage, and work together can be a powerful and effective weapon to counter terrorism. And this is also the goal of the Youth Atlantic Treaty Association, and mainly of its 24 national chapters, to serve for its young members as an active open platform of discussion that encourage the development of educational programs, trying also to empower youth by including them in such important panels as this event is. In my perspective, when I first met Yata Israel, I was a part of the former executive board member, and I came to know to a social movement that was just started to being implemented in the Yata Israel. And we are glad to have been witness and participating with some of our national chapters at one of the most, let's say, important project from our Israel's chapter. And also I would like to thank Professor Ganor for the idea of the social movement Enough Terrorism. For some of us, this is a new information, but the same goals as this movement promotes, also Yata aims to unify our young member regardless of race, religion, political affiliation, gender, or color, to stand against and delegitimate also the phenomenon of terrorism. This is why at the beginning and also in continuous, Enough Terrorism was liked when Yata was introduced at it and when we were introduced at it. I would like to say and to note here that several Yata chapters, I can mention him, Yata Italy, Yata Albania, we were also discussing with Yata Norway to join the Enough Terrorism movement and to gather our own activities alongside this social movement in countering terrorism activities. But Yata's work and Yata's effort in developing relevant, engaging dialogues in person, but also online, especially in the area of COVID-19 restrictions, aims not only to inform, but also to educate the next generation. And the efforts of Yata and alongside with working with the ATA in Brussels is to scale up youth events and projects in order to have a huge impact in our own societies back home, in raising awareness on the values such as also Stevie mentioned, the rule of law, democracy, freedom, belief, or freedom of expression. And taking into the consideration the pandemic restriction, what we left is communication through each other. And communication is the only tool to promote tolerance, diversity, and the main weapon to countering the narrative of terrorism among us, but not only among our association. Being composed of 24 youth national chapters with different political system and cultures, Yata serves and offers a network of NATO member countries, but as well as NATO partner countries who can have the benefit and take advantages from our lessons learned and from our own activities, but at the same time envision our own attitudes toward countering terrorism, this phenomenon we are discussing it. I may say that for Yata, being part also of this movement that the Israel chapter has launched, and this campaign like 2 years ago from now set an example throughout our association for the activities and the action we can take for a specific social dimension of our own actions. When we saw how several youth chapters became part of it, we saw how Yata can be a tool to empower not only youth, but to raise awareness also for several important issues and emerging security challenges that NATO and its partner countries or member countries are facing up. I would like to give not only my contribution, but to the whole executive board of Yata contribution, not only this term of our election, but also in the future, in order to foster and to move forward all the initiatives of the Yata Israel chapter, but also in collaborating with joint projects among ourselves. I would like again to congratulate with you in this inaugural event and to wish you all the best in your future. Thank you, Stevie. The word is yours.
Thank you, Gina. It was a pleasure to hear your remarks. And we now have a very exciting panel. We have distinguished guests here with me today. Mr. Gabriele Cascone, who is the head of the Counter-Terrorism section at the Emerging Security Challenges Division at NATO. We have Mr. Brian Jenkins, who is the senior advisor to the president at RAND Corporation, Professor Boaz Ganor, founder and executive director of the ICT, and Dr. Liram Stenzler-Koblentz, who is a researcher and head of the Global Far-Right Extremism Desk. A little bit about the logistics. Each speaker will have about 10 minutes for their remarks, and we will then have a short Q&A session. I have some questions for our speakers, and for anyone who has questions for the speakers, they can send via chat to the host of the event, and we will take it from there. I will just briefly introduce each of the speakers before the panel. And Mr. Gabriele Cascone, as I said, is the head of the Counter-Terrorism section in the Emerging Security Challenges Division at NATO. And he spent his first part of his career serving as an officer in the Carabinieri Corps. And Mr. Cascone joined NATO in 1998, where he served in 3 divisions: NATO Office of Security, Political Affairs, and Emerging Security Challenges, where his focus was mostly on the Western Balkans, the Middle East, and North Africa. So Mr. Cascone will discuss NATO's counterterrorism work and the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. Cascone, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dafne, and it's a real pleasure and an honor for me to be invited to this inaugural event of Yata Israel. As there is a panel of very distinguished speakers that will follow me, I will not delve so much into the specificities of COVID. I will try more to stick to what NATO does in counterterrorism, and I will only add at the end a couple of personal consideration on how the pandemic may have affected our work in that respect. First of all, I think that it is very interesting that you use the word counterterrorism work. It's one that I like very much, because every time that people ask me about the strategy, I simply don't know what to reply, in the sense we don't have a strategy as such. The idea is NATO considers itself in the field of counterterrorism as part of an effort by the international community, and an effort to which it can add something in the areas where it has real expertise. So it's not about going along with some kind of grand vision of the world, but it is about contributing to the international effort against terrorism. And going a bit back in history, I would say it's unfortunately almost very soon it will be the 20th anniversary of the date since we started really to discuss seriously terrorism at NATO, because it all really started with 9/11. It's not just because it was such a tragic and important date, but until then, inside the alliance, the idea was very much that terrorism was a domestic issue. It was not something that really had to do with the military and security alliance. So it was only the attack on the United States, which I think it's always important to remember. It's the only occasion in its 72 years history when NATO declared the famous Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, so the collective defense clause, where all allies say that an attack against one of them is considered as an attack against all of them. So it's basically due to that there was this major shift, and terrorists become part and parcel, or became much more relevant in the work of NATO as such. So at the end of these 20 years of work on countering terrorism and countering terrorism, where is NATO in this moment in its counter-terrorist work? Well, first of all, we work along three main lines: awareness, capabilities, and engagement. Awareness is about improving our understanding of the terrorist phenomenon. Capabilities is about developing the tools, again, in areas where NATO has the right expertise to help the fight against terrorism. And engagement is engaging with our international partners, countries, or organizations in contributing to the international fight against terrorism. All of this work is basically summed up in a kind of handbook or overall document, which we call the NATO Action Plan Against Terrorism, which was first approved by the heads of state and government 4 years ago in 2017. It has already undergone 2 revisions, and will probably have, without the problem, we'll have a new revision this year with a view to having a 4th iteration for the end of 2021. And the action plan is largely a manual or a series of activities, of concrete activities that we try to carry forward in the field of counterterrorism. And let me group them to give you a better understanding of what is NATO doing in the field of counterterrorism. The first area, as I mentioned, is awareness. And this was primarily improved to the establishment at NATO quarters of a terrorism intelligence cell, which tries to gather the information from allies and partners and use these to provide studies and analysis of the terrorist phenomena, both in terms of its geographical expansion and ramifications, and also in terms of the tools, modus operandi, trends in the terrorist reality. The second area is that of capabilities, and here we focus mostly on how we can increase what allies can improve in their own arsenal of in fighting terrorism. Areas of work in this respect are, for example, the work that we are conducting on countering unmanned aerial systems, or the work that we are conducting on the response to a possible terrorist CBRN attack, or the extensive work, unfortunately, based on an extensive record of incidents on countering improvised explosive devices. So this is really about what are the technological and the policy instruments that we can implement to improve our ability to respond to terrorism. Also in this field of capabilities, an area which has seen very strong political interest and where we have tried and we're still conducting, I would say, some important work is the area of battlefield evidence. So how can we use data, information, documents, you name them, collected on the ground to bring terrorists to justice in their country of origin or in the countries where they are apprehended. And as you can imagine, it's a pretty vast field because there is an entire issue of multinational exchange, transfer of information from military to law enforcement, which, as you know, are two communities with their own rules of the game, which do not always perfectly coincide. But this is, we consider, is one of the areas where, based on its operational experience, NATO could really provide an additional boost to the international fight against terrorism. The third area that I would like to underline is the area of engagement with partners, which is what we call capacity building, which is mostly helping partners to develop their own ability, or in some cases, and this is often the case with Israel, is an exchange of experience to see what we can learn from each other, what partners can bring to the table, and what we have that we can bring to the table with a partner which can be helpful to them. And this is probably another large area of work, which is where we try to keep very practical, so not so much the theoretical part of meetings, but really practical hands-on training or exchange of experience in some of the areas that I mentioned before. So these are very much the areas into which we are trying to focus our work and that we're trying to carry forward, and that we will continue to carry forward for the foreseeable future. As I am approaching the end of my 10 minutes, let me just add a couple of very short considerations on how, as an organization, COVID has affected our counterterrorism work. The first thing that it all immediately springs to mind is that, of course, the limitation on travel have also limited our ability, for example, to conduct the capacity building work. I mean, this is hands-on training. The training on countering IEDs is not something that you can do by showing an IED online. It's something that needs to be done with the hands-on activity. So, of course, this has clearly limited our ability to conduct that. We continued the more theoretical and classwork-like training, but there are areas where we definitely need to catch up. A second area that I would highlight is the fact that also at policy level, online is not always the best way to develop policies or to work together. There are discussions that needs to be had in person, either because of the sensitivity of the information or because sometimes in order to build consensus, especially in a multilateral organization such as NATO, you need to be able to have also the chat in the margins, the chat in the corridor, the one that does not happen through what is at the end of the day a very formal medium such as this one can be, although I adore it because it allows me to reach to all of you without needing to get on a plane, move, but this is something that we also need to take into account. And the third element that we saw also in the interaction with some of our partners is that there have been a number of countries where the armed forces have been in the front line of responding to the pandemic. And so in addition to our own limitations in reaching out to them for training and engagement, there is a limitation from their side because the priority at this point is a different one, and the usual interlocutors are maybe focused on policing lockdowns, helping protective medical material to reach the different hospitals in the country, and so on. So it is definitely a situation which has created a series of multiple challenges. We've been able, I would say, to navigate it so far with some success, but of course we look forward to the return to a new normal, probably which will not be like the old normal, but something that also allows us the ability to engage directly in person. And I would stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cascone, for discussing NATO's work with us and for mentioning some of the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. We all hope that we will soon go back to the new normal. We now have next in our panel our dear Professor Boaz Ganor. And Professor Boaz Ganor is the founder and executive director of the Institute for Counter-Terrorism. And he is the former dean of the Law School of Government, Diplomacy and Strategy. I think for describing Professor Ganor's contribution to the field of counterterrorism, we would probably need to have another session dedicated for that. I won't have enough time. But I want to say that when we talk about how Yata Israel can contribute to the larger Yata network, I think he is one of the reasons why we would be able to contribute a lot to this network with his knowledge and contributions. Without any further ado, Professor Ganor, the floor is yours. I see that already we have the slide on COVID-19 and the lessons learned from a counterterrorism perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dafne, and I would like to thank all the organizers, starting with Ata and Yata, of course, Stevie and Gina, and all my dear friends in the panel, this distinguished panel that we have today, and all the participants that bothered themselves to join us. I would like, in a very short period of time, to share with you practically two things. First is the way I see the common denominators between those two phenomenon, or if you wish, two pandemias, the COVID-19 pandemia and global terrorism pandemia, and I refer to that as a pandemia as well. The second thing is, what can we learn from this crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, and the challenges that we have faced in reference to current and future trends of terrorism altogether. So I'll try to squeeze all of that into 10 minutes, and I would start with the common denominators in reference to the phenomenon itself. So first of all, as I said before, I refer to those two phenomenons as epidemic phenomenon. COVID-19, it's quite clear, no need for an explanation why it's an epidemic phenomenon. But why terrorism should be regarded as an epidemic phenomenon? And for that purpose, think about incitement, for example. Incitement for terrorism. This is a poisonous spreading phenomenon, cross-border phenomenon, contagious in its nature, and also have an exponential impact. One person can incite and radicalize so many other people around the world altogether. So we see how this phenomenon is being spreading to different parts of the world in a rapid manner and growing in a very dangerous way. So that's the epidemic impact, or the epidemic characteristic of the phenomenon. The second thing is the fact that both pandemias actually are spreading anxiety. Terrorism is all about terrorizing. It's a psychological warfare, as we all know. And we all fully understand the fear and anxiety that come out of the last year COVID-19 crisis. The threat that this is posing to each and every one of us is the factor that actually spread this fear and anxiety. Furthermore, we in Israel start now to hopefully recover from the crisis of COVID-19 as an outcome of very thorough immunization process. But it's quite clear that we are going to suffer, and the whole world is going to suffer from the implication of this pandemic, and the implication will be economical. Many people have been hurt and damaged severely from the impact of COVID-19, and terrorism is also creating a huge economical impact. Think about the impact of 9/11, for example, on the air travel, on insurance, and so on and so forth. So the extreme economical impact is also a common denominator. Furthermore, the worst case scenario is the collapse of governance. Terrorists would like to shake the stability of different countries and create a lack of governance in those places. And coronavirus seems to have the same impact in some places around the world. You could see the demonstrations, anarchist reaction, positions against immunizations, and so on and so forth. So those are the common denominators in a nutshell of the two phenomena. But even more interesting is the common denominators that has to do with countering the two phenomena. And the first thing I would mention here is what we call the democratic dilemma. Well, the democratic dilemma in counterterrorism, it's the obvious tension between efficiency in countering terrorism and guarding liberal democratic values. Some people trying to turn a blind eye to the fact that there is a contradiction between the two, but I think that every expert in the field will tell you that by all means, those two are contradictory. It's easier to fight terrorism in a dictatorship, not that I recommend that, but it's easier. Of course, it's easier to stick to your liberal democratic values if you don't suffer from terrorist attacks and don't want to contribute to the global efforts in prevention. The whole art of counterterrorism is finding the right balance in this dilemma. How can we be effective in counterterrorism and guard liberal democratic values at the same time? Now, of course, that this dilemma, it's even intensifies as the fact that if you are not effective in your policies, counterterrorism policies, it would lead to loss of life, sometimes even huge number of loss of lives, as we saw in 9/11 and other places altogether. So that intensified the dilemma. Now let's go back to the coronavirus. Same thing, I would argue. This democratic dilemma, if you want to be effective in contending with the coronavirus, you probably need to limit liberal democratic value. Think about privacy, think about crowding, think about the right of movement from place to place, and so on and so forth. All of those are fundamental liberal democratic values that need to be held back, at least temporarily, in order to be effective in your counter-corona measures. In Israel, by the way, there is another interesting common denominator, and that's the use of AI and big data surveillance that was used traditionally in counterterrorism and was transferred and shifted also to counter the coronavirus in Israel. And of course, that all of that leads to the need of checks and balances in order to find the right balance between those two ends of this tension. International cooperation. Well, we have Mr. Cascone here with us, and he can probably vouch for the fact that you cannot be effective in counterterrorism if there is no international cooperation. NATO is doing that on a daily basis and supporting those who needs to be supported, sharing knowledge, sharing experience, and so on and so forth. Counterterrorism, terrorism is a global phenomenon. As said, they cross border and so on and so forth. You need to see to it that you would have the same level or approximately the same level of different countries in being able to contend with this phenomenon of terrorism. Without that, everybody would suffer as an outcome of that. Quite clear that this international cooperation is crucial also in contending with the coronavirus. What's the meaning of improving the situation in one country? Once you open the border of the country, you have free transportation from one country to another country, one state to another state, and immediately you would have an impact on the other state as well. So it all need to be synchronized internationally all together and have some kind of a joint success threshold for different countries. Last but not least is the fact that in both pandemics, you find yourself dealing with specific communities which are vulnerable more than others. Immigrants communities, when we talk about counter-terrorism, and elderly communities, or in Israel and the Jewish society, the Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox community, which was founded as more vulnerable than other. And you need to find a way to work with them, build their trust in order to succeed in your efforts. So what can we learn from that for the current and the future trends of terrorism? So first of all, let me suggest the concept of terrorism as a certain type of a fashion. It's a fashioned business, meaning as people which knows more than me on fashion will tell you that fashion comes, fashion goes, fashion returns from time to time. It's evolving all the time. That's how terrorism works. Terrorism is a fashioned business. And what we see now, what we saw even before the coronavirus crisis started, we saw that there was a shift, or a beginning of a shift of the fashion of terrorism. The fashioned ISIS become less fashionist. And the whole question was, what will happen when ISIS is losing his hybridity, losing his appeal? And ISIS was, until recently, a year ago, 2 years ago, what I would refer to as a hybrid terrorist organization, a terrorist organization that controls territory and population. Therefore, it's involved in pure terrorist activity, but also in pseudo-legitimate activity, dawah activity, political activity, giving all the services to the community that they control and so on and so forth. They lost that. They lost the war in Syria and Iraq. And now the question is, what would come after the crisis of Corona with ISIS? Would ISIS find another territory to establish a new Islamic state and compensate himself for the loss of the territory of Syria? Would it become a classical terrorist organization that do not control territory under the radar, only inspire other terrorists like the lone wolves networks and conducting organized terrorist activity? Yet to be seen. Another actor which we need to look at is Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda known very much, many losses actually, way before the coronavirus started, losing the territory in Afghanistan, the killing of Bin Laden, al-Masri, and many other leaders, and so on and so forth. Also, Al-Qaeda would find itself in a transforming. Think about the decision of United States and other countries to get out of Afghanistan. That's an opportunity, of course, for those elements. We know about the connections between Al-Qaeda and Iran, and the vacuum that is being created by ISIS. It's definitely tempting for Al-Qaeda to try at least to fill this vacuum, yet to be seen what will happen after the crisis of Corona. I would also suggest to look very closely on what we used to know as state-sponsored terrorism, and especially on Iran. Iran has become embedded within different territories in the Middle East, in Asia, in other parts of the world, using proxies for terrorist activity, for subversive activity. I'm talking about Hezbollah, I'm talking about Shiite militias, Houthis in Yemen, and so on and so forth. They do not hesitate to use them to promote their interests, and they definitely would not hesitate to use them in the future. The last slide I want to share with you is this slide. What we should consider as the main threats in the coming months, immediately, hopefully after the recovery from the Corona crisis, is in the Islamist world. We tend to see, or we tend to believe to see, much more inspiration attacks, those lone wolves, so-called lone wolves, and others, local networks, which are being inspired by ISIS, by other Islamist elements. Far-right terrorism. We saw the increase of far-right terrorism even before the corona started. We saw the involvement of far-right terrorism in at least in discussing the possibility of using bioterrorism during the corona virus. And there are many common denominators and actually mutual impact between those two elements, which one inspire others, intrigue others to the other side to conduct further attacks. Both of them are very active on social networks. So I think that the combination of the threat coming from one side from the Islamist terrorism and the other side from far-right terrorism would actually challenge the safety, stability, and peace in the world in the coming years, maybe in the coming decade. Thank you, Dafne.
Thank you very much, Professor Boaz Ganor, for this very informative remarks about the common denominators between the terrorism pandemic and the coronavirus pandemic. I would like to now turn to Mr. Brian Jenkins, who is a dear friend of ICT, and he is the senior advisor to the president at RAND Corporation, and he is the author of numerous books, reports, and articles on terrorism-related topics. I could also go on and speak about Mr. Jenkins' contributions to the field of terrorism for long, but I prefer to steal Professor Ganor's definition of Mr. Brian Jenkins that he mentioned a few weeks ago during our event on Professor Gerald Post, who was a pioneer in the field of psychological terrorism. And Professor Boaz Ganor defined Mr. Jenkins like this: he is a unique combination of an outstanding scholar, officer, and gentleman. And I can't agree with this definition more. So Mr. Jenkins, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It is an honor for me to participate in this conference, and I must say a pleasure to be reunited with, at least via Zoom, with so many of my friends in Israel and in Europe. I'm not sure how ATA defines youth, but I suspect it means those considerably younger than 60, while I am considerably older. So let me begin with a quick overview of the global situation 60 years ago. 60 years ago, in fact, it was almost 60 years ago exactly, that a Soviet ultimatum led to the 1961 Berlin crisis. I was in Army boot camp that summer. We prepared for war. War was avoided, but we again came close during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, and again we prepared for war. While Cold War confrontations dominated military thinking, we faced a growing challenge from guerrilla wars in Latin America and Southeast Asia and elsewhere. These were the precursors of urban guerrilla warfare, which in turn led ultimately to the international terrorist campaigns we saw beginning in the later 1960s. The 1960s were also a period of domestic tumult in the United States, with growing political violence, assassinations, race riots, defiance by white supremacists, and increasingly by anti-war protests that led ultimately to the terrorist bombing campaigns in the following decade. The same political turbulence of the 1960s affected Europe and gave rise to the terrorist campaigns of the 1970s there. Nuclear proliferation was another growing concern in the early 1960s. At that time, France was testing nuclear weapons in the Sahara, and indeed for a worrisome 3 days, faced the possibility that its opponents might seize a nuclear device during a 1961 revolt by French generals in Algeria. Until the beginning of the 1960s, China regularly shelled and threatened to seize 2 small islands off its coast belonging to Taiwan. This became an issue in the 1960 elections in the United States. At the same time, China was also increasing its enrichment of uranium and tested its first nuclear bomb in 1964. So how much have things changed in the last 60 years? Or have they? The Berlin Wall came down, to be sure, and the Soviet Union, after withdrawing from an unwinnable war in Afghanistan, collapsed. However, post-Soviet Russia is now massing its troops on the border with Ukraine, prompting strong warnings from NATO. 4 more nations since the early 60s have now acquired nuclear weapons, and Iran has recently announced it is beginning nuclear enrichment to 60%, which is getting very close to fissile material. China has expanded its presence in the South China Sea and has just issued new threats to Taiwan. Meanwhile, the United States is deeply divided domestically by widespread protests over continuing racism and faces growing right-wing extremism. We expect the next decade to be a very tumultuous one. And the United States recently announced the withdrawal of its military forces from Afghanistan, which was followed up just days ago by an announcement by NATO nations, their decisions to also withdraw. The war in Afghanistan will not end with Western withdrawal, so we shall see what will happen there. Jihadists still dominate large swathes of territory in Syria and Iraq. They have expanded their presence in Africa, and they have carried out a number of recent terrorist attacks in Europe, which also faces a growing challenge from right-wing extremists. The 1960s, interestingly, were bracketed by 2 pandemics. The so-called Asian flu of 1957, 1958, and the Hong Kong flu in 1968. The Hong Kong flu killed as many as 4 million people worldwide. We're not sure the exact numbers. COVID-19 has thus far killed approximately 3 million. It seems that the more things change, the more it is the same thing. Whether you find this to be a source of relief that we have survived such perils before, or a cause for dismay that we continue to face such a dangerous world, I leave you to ponder. But let me turn the page and now look ahead to the possible immediate and long-term effects of the current pandemic on the economy, on society, on crime, and on conflict. Clearly, the pandemic will have political repercussions. In some cases, I believe it will promote conflict. It could affect the future course of terrorism. Much of what we have seen during the current pandemic recalls previous large-scale outbreaks of disease. We've seen the defiance of measures implemented to prevent the spread of the disease, leading in some cases to civil disobedience and social unrest, and in a few cases, a couple of terrorist plots. We have seen physical threats and violent attacks targeting both health officials and political leaders. Some US health officials must now travel with bodyguards. Minorities and foreigners are again being blamed for the outbreak. The 1968 Hong Kong pandemic was referred to by many as the Mao flu. American political leadership has insisted on calling COVID-19 the China flu or Kung flu. And we've seen a disturbing increase in verbal and physical attacks on Asians in the United States and in Europe, as well as in Australia. Pandemics fuel existing prejudices and racism. Jews have been the traditional targets and were attacked during medieval plagues. White supremacists today fantasize about weaponizing the virus to kill Jews, Muslims, diverse populations. In terms of political effects, perceived incompetence, corruption, or callousness in responding to the disaster can often bring down the downfall of governments, and we'll see how that plays out. We certainly have seen that pandemics have disastrous short-term effects on economies. They exacerbate existing economic and social inequalities. They lead to increases in violent crime. The murder rate in the United States in 2020 climbed sharply. Domestic violent abuse is way up. Pandemics at the same time create new opportunities for organized crime in terms of new products and services, such as fake tests, black market vaccines, counterfeit vaccination cards, as well as a larger recruiting reservoir among desperate people. A final observation on the observable effects in the current pandemic is the nihilism, reckless behavior, flaunting of the rules as if nothing matters. The longer-term consequences of the pandemic are more insidious. They're hard to separate from other factors, and the connections here are more tenuous. Therefore, our conclusions have to be more tentative. Certainly, democracy took a hit. For the first time in many years, progress toward democracy declined in 2020, wiping out 15 years of gain. This is not simply because many governments increased controls owing to the pandemic, as Boaz was talking about, but also because many governments exploited the health emergency to erode democratic gains. Democratic governments did not protect their citizens against the pandemic any better than did authoritarian regimes. Indeed, of the world's 23 full democracies, 39% of them experienced per capita mortality rates below the world median, while 61% had mortality rates above that median. Now, clearly advanced economies have been no more successful than developing economies in protecting or caring for their populations. There are many possible explanations for this. One is the pandemic is still surging in many countries, in Brazil, for example, in India. These are not the final counts. And a second factor is that COVID-19 deaths are probably not accurately reported in many developing parts of the world, while other diseases and afflictions still kill far many people. But the optics are undeniable here. It's not that democracies or economically advanced countries necessarily fared a lot worse, but thus far they have not obviously done a hell of a lot better. As mentioned previously, the pandemic will exacerbate existing inequalities. Clearly, it's had a devastating impact on the global economy, but the effects are uneven. This will become more apparent in the recovery. Some countries will recover very quickly, while others, especially those dependent on the export of basic commodities or on tourism, places like Egypt, Jordan, and elsewhere, the economic recovery will be a lot slower. The recovery of poorer nations will also be impeded by the loss of foreign assistance and investment as countries and companies deal with their own recovery challenges. As a result of all this, the figures vary from 200 million to perhaps 1 billion additional people will be living in extreme poverty by 2030. Now, that's a result of the pandemic and slow economic recovery. And this reverses a 30-year trend that has a reversal that has significant consequences. Discontent rises when people's expectations are unfulfilled. Rising out of extreme poverty, then being pushed back down could fuel future internal conflicts. Historically, extreme poverty also drives migration, and one can expect that the uneven recovery and desperation will create new waves of migrants, legal and illegal. Possible increases in conflict will add to the push. Now, this will come at a time when the preferred destination countries, Europe, the United States, other countries, are already showing increased resistance to immigration, which has created domestic tensions, provoked backlash by nationalist groups, and growing violence against immigrant populations. Now, closing down the legal routes means more illegal immigration, creating increased human traffic opportunities for organized crime. Will this economic desperation and these increased social tensions lead to armed rebellions, civil wars, wars between nations? Here, certainly it's a possibility, but some caution is in order. Historically, warfare is a prevalent feature in human history. One could randomly scatter epidemics over the roughly 700 years since the Black Death of the mid-14th century and never be far in time or space from an armed conflict. Proximity, however, doesn't mean causality. There are some studies indicating possible connections between epidemics and armed conflict, but no clear historical pattern. The current pandemic has prompted renewed concerns about bioterrorism attacks. Certainly has inspired extremists to think about how COVID-19 might be weaponized. Most of this chatter on the internet can be described as intimidation and scare tactics, not evidence of new plots, although in my view, it's never healthy to have a lot of extremists thinking about the subject. Actual incidents of bioterrorism are rare and usually involve ricin, which is a toxin, or anthrax, which is an infectious bacteria, but neither is contagious. It's interesting that right-wing extremists appear to share a particular fascination with biological weapons. They fuel genocidal fantasies, scenarios of societal breakdown that drive survivalists and preppers. I do want to give a shout out to Ellie Carmon, a colleague at the ICT, who has written a terrific analysis of the radical right's obsession with bioterrorism. And I think that obsession is the operative word there. I strongly recommend that you read his report. In sum, what we can say is that pandemics have a long tail. They cause a massive loss of lives, social and economic disruption, and leave behind legacies of disorder, desperation, and defiance. Now, how these play out over the coming decade will reflect other factors, or to use a term we have all become familiar with during this pandemic, it will depend very much on pre-existing conditions. At any rate, it will be a turbulent, exciting future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jenkins. I would like to now turn to Dr. Liram Stenzler-Koblentz, who is a dear colleague at the ICT. She is the head of the Global Far-Right Extremism Desk at the ICT, and she is also an internal relations manager at the Institute. Liram has been recently focusing on right-wing terrorism and how the COVID-19 pandemic is going hands in hand with right-wing extremism. And she will be speaking about far-right extremism and the use of COVID-19 vaccines, which I believe is a fascinating topic. Liram, the floor is yours.
Hey, thanks. It's a real pleasure to be here, and good afternoon to you all. So in the next 10 minutes, I would like to talk, as Dafne mentioned, about the use of COVID-19 vaccine of far-right extremists. So let me start by saying that, as we all know, since the outbreak of the pandemic, people are required to practice social distancing, which in many cases requires them to stay indoors. Sometimes they can be alone, they are flooded with negative emotions. It can be loneliness, confusion, or even anger. And far-right extremists use these emotions in order to achieve their goals. And I'm going to talk specifically on white supremacists. So what are the white supremacists' goals? They believe that the current social order aims against them, and that Western governments are corrupt, since they follow values such as pluralism or globalization. They want to destroy the social order, as Professor Ganor mentioned, and they want to build a new and pure social order. So it seems that they treat the corona pandemic as a gift and an opportunity to do exactly that, to build a new social order. And we started to see on multiple social media networks that are used by the far-right extremists from the end of, let's say, October 2020, parallel to the rapid creation and approval and distribution of multiple COVID-19 vaccines, they started to share material questioning the effectiveness and the purpose of the vaccines. And it was very, very interesting trend that we started to recognize. And during my presentation, I would like to point out a few interesting threats that we identified. So the first one is increasing chaos. And far-right extremists want people to resist taking the vaccine, okay? That's what they really desire. They discussed in social media how fear of white people from the vaccine and their refuse to take it will help them in their mission to destabilize the existing system. As we can see in the right post, we'll start from there, they want that people will resist taking the vaccine. So many will turn against the system. And the other post that you see is talking about events that are accelerating. Okay, so that was the first trend we recognized. Another trend we identified is increasing recruitment and radicalization. So with the advent of the COVID-19 vaccines in late 2020, far-right extremists increased their efforts to radicalize potential recruits to their cause. So specifically, as you will see here in the post, they talked about people from the anti-vaccine movement. And as you see, they really sketch their strategy. So first, as they write, they say, if many people will refuse to get the vaccine, then authorities will need to use more force, okay? And that's good for them. It serves what they want to achieve. Then secondly, they want that the white public will not trust the system. So they will have the chance to further radicalize the white wingers, and of course, especially people, as I said, from the anti-vaccine movement. As you see in the other post, they talk especially about them. An additional trend that was recognized by us is the connection between the COVID-19 vaccine to conspiracy theory. To assist with their overall recruitment and radicalization efforts that I just mentioned, far-right extremists try to link the COVID-19 vaccine to existing white nationalist conspiracy theory. Okay, take for example the conspiracy theory, the Great Replacement. Okay, that suggests that minorities are systematically replacing the white race. And with the approval of the vaccine, the far-right extremists started to say that vaccine is part of that plot, and they want to sterilize specific group in the population. Okay, the group is the white race. And if you see in one of the posts here, they really write about the impact of fertility of women. Okay, you can see the 97%. in the middle, the post-it in the middle, you can see that they are talking about the white genocide, okay, because of the mass sterilization. Now, of course, we can see connection to anti-Semitism, and we can see those posts often. For example, the post on your right, we found on a German language far-right message board. They have claimed that the COVID-19 vaccine is part of a Jewish conspiracy to kill the German people as a revenge of what the Nazis made during the Holocaust, during World War II. And you see in the middle, they show the CEOs of the pharma companies, AstraZeneca, Pfizer, Moderna, who happen to be Jewish, as the people who profit from the vaccine. So we can see here the conspiracy theory, and we can see the anti-Semitic claims. The additional trend we started to see is the fostering anti-minority sentiment related to the COVID-19 vaccine. So expanding on their belief that the vaccines are harmful and really cause mass sterilization, as we just saw, they have begun a campaign to encourage minorities to take the vaccine. So minorities will receive it, while people from the white race will not receive it. And they really want to try to encourage them not to take it. You can see in the middle, the post that really shows that strategy. Okay, they want that Black people will be vaccinated, while whites won't get the vaccine. And if you'll see on your left, you'll see a post that has a hashtag. The hashtag says Vax the Blacks, and it's part of a bigger campaign that we started to see in early December. They really try to force people to vaccine only Black people. Another thing that we saw, and you'll see it on your right, we found posts suggesting that far-right actors should create false profiles and pretend to be a Black person. So in order to convince people to take the vaccine. And I didn't mention, but all the things that you see, all the posts that we see are posts that we monitoring during the way, and are taken from all kind of social media. The last trend I would like to point out is leveraging anti-vaccine conspiracies to encourage lone wolf attacks. And I find it as the most dangerous one. It may show us a shift from the cyberspace to the actual world, from only talking to really taking actions and carry attacks. So in late February 2021, we discovered on a forum in the darknet posts that suggesting carry out attacks against COVID-19 vaccine manufacturers and infrastructures. And they want to combat vaccine distribution. They want that people want to be able to take the vaccines, and not just people, of course, the white race. So one of the posts, for example, just suggests that a future lone wolf attacker should use Timothy McVeigh modus operandi against the vaccine manufacturing center. As I'm sure you all know, Timothy McVeigh used an explosive car in 1995 against the federal building in Oklahoma City. He killed 168 people. And as you'll see in the other post, they claim that Jewish people were responsible for the COVID-19 vaccine, and as lone wolf attacks should be made against vaccination production and Jewish people. Okay, you see the word kaik, it means Jewish in their own slang. They even put the image that you can see on the post. It's Andreas Breivik. He committed an attack in Norway in 2011, and he killed more than 60 people. To sum up, everything I said, I want to say that we must be aware of this kind of rhetoric, because failure to respond and limit transmission of those messages may decrease public trust in the vaccine. And we don't want it. We want the public will believe in the vaccine, will take the vaccine. We want the world to be better. Look at Israel, right? It's a fantastic example. So I wish that they won't succeed in their plot. And thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Liram, for this fascinating and very, very interesting presentation. So I would like to look at the time. We have about 12 minutes for the questions. I have several questions to all our panelists. And if time permits, we'll also take additional questions. You can send them through the chat to the host of the event. My first question to all the panelists is that the COVID-19 pandemic has shown that we are really facing a global phenomenon that is transcending borders, and it's really a different type of threat that we are facing. And we have seen that the virus of hate and incitement to terrorism are as contagious as the corona pandemic. So my first question to you is that, can we apply lessons learned from the pandemic, in a nutshell, to counterterrorism in your relevant field? What are the key lessons learned to be taken from this difficult period? And my second question is on international cooperation. At NATO, we say usually stronger together. At the Institute for Counter-Terrorism, we say it takes a network to beat a network. So I would like to ask to all our panelists, what are, in your views, the 2-3 critical steps to have a better international cooperation to counter terrorism? What can we do in the future to ensure that we would have a better international cooperation? If any of the speakers would like to start, they can take the floor, or I can keep on with the other questions. I see that Professor
Dafne, I think I will be very brief, because as for the first question, practically I refer to that in my presentation. What are the lessons learned? Yet can we learn? And I would say that, and it ties to the second question, which is how can we have better international cooperation? When one of the main, most important lesson learned is that there is a need for a better international cooperation in both pandemics. And since you focused on the question on the global terrorism pandemic, I would say this statement that nobody would be surprised from those people who knows me in this forum, that the most important pillar is acknowledging that we are fighting the same phenomenon, is acknowledging that we are facing the same danger. And in order to acknowledge that, we need to name it, or if you wish, to define it. It seems so simple, but after so many years, I find it unbelievable that the international community still didn't, and the scholarly community still didn't reach the agreement of what terrorism is. At least what is coronavirus is we all know and understand, and once we understand that, we can find better ways to cooperate. But when we are having those mixed definitions of terrorism, guerrilla, insurgency, hate crimes, and so on and so forth, until we would make some order in those definitions, and based on that, we will have some kind of agreement what terrorism is, then only then we will be able to establish much better international cooperation in contending with this growing threats altogether.
I can't agree more with you. And also at the Institute for Counter-Terrorism, I know that you are working recently on developing a definition of right-wing terrorism nowadays, which is also very important.
Yeah, true, and trying to actually explain what is right-wing terrorism and what is hate crime, and there is a difference between them, and where does the threshold lies between those two phenomena.
Can I add a comment? First of all, let me endorse Boaz's always insightful observations. I would say, in response to your questions, there are three issues. In terms of looking at the threat of pandemics, whether from natural causes or man-made, here we have the case of traditional military alliances, traditional focuses on military challenges, dealing with an unconventional, non-traditional challenge, and that requires not simply new weapons. It requires really fundamental rethinking, and we had to do some of that fundamental rethinking when we went against terrorism. Second, clearly, to underscore Boaz's comment there, international cooperation is required. That I agree with Boaz. That should be easier this time because we are dealing with identifiable pathogens, with diseases, and in contrast to terrorism, the pandemic affects the world, the entire world, in a very obvious fashion, whereas in terrorism, it affected the world unevenly. It was a bigger problem for some than for others. I think the third issue is that this is not a contest that's going to be a finite undertaking as in wars of long ago. This is a long struggle. We are going to lack the kinds of traditional victories, but rather looking at our ability to contain, to limit these. And I think that really is a characteristic of the challenges we face in the future, whether it's pandemics, whether it's global warming, whether it's mass legal and illegal movement of people in response to these. These are fundamentally different problems where the military role is, it may at times be important, but is limited, but the alliances are critical.
Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. Mr. Cascone, would you like to add a few words?
Yeah, well, very quickly, and like you said, the first question was already in what Dr. Ganor's presentation was saying, and I think there are a lot of lessons learned from the pandemic, and lessons learned, unfortunately, sometimes in the wrong direction. I mean, in the sense, for example, we all agree it was a global phenomenon, and what the first thing that we saw was the resurrection of borders. Even in areas like as Europe, where you should have free movement, should be one of the basic principles that establish it, there was immediately this instinctive reflex. I look to myself, I look to my people, and whatever happens beyond my borders is not my problem. You saw again the same debate on should we donate vaccines to those who don't have, for example, poorer countries which cannot buy it, and immediately the controversy was no, first we have to take care of our own people. So I think that there are two opposing poles of global phenomenon requires global reactions, but at the same time, the reactions of nations are extremely territorial in the proper meaning of the word. The second thing that I think is very important in terms of the lessons learned, I was fascinated by Boaz's presentation and was explaining the issue about surrendering some freedoms, and then he pointed out which is something to which I'm very attached, the importance of checks and balances. The fact that you need to have in democracies a system where, okay, if I surrender something, but then there is an outside and independent, whatever power that controls what is going on. And when we come to lessons learned, I think we have some virtuous lessons learned. In Israel was especially the vaccination campaign, but in handling the pandemics, I look at some Southeast Asian or Oceanian democracies like, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. They were pretty successful in handling it without resorting to a Chinese-style mode of control of the population. And this, I think, it's something that we as democracy should try to embed, and also in an area where, like terrorism, where you always have this dilemma of how much can we control the population against how much do we have to guarantee freedoms, and how much can we be violating their basic freedoms in the name of security. I think there are some virtuous examples that I could that we can look upon and that we should take on board.
Thank you, Mr. Cascone. We are about to reach the end of our session. Liram, would you like to add anything, or should I close?
I don't want to repeat things that people are saying, but me as well thinks that what Professor Ganor mentioned about the democratic dilemma is one of the main things that we have to take with ourselves. Israel, for example, had really bad time trying to maintain all the freedoms of the people from the one hand, and the effectiveness and trying to decrease the disease. And I think that now it's getting better and better, but it's not fair, since we have vaccines and it's much easier and it's harder in different countries now. So I think that's one of the most important things.
Thank you very much, Liram. I would like to thank all of you for joining this event. Before closing, I would like to say a little bit about Yata Israel and our future activities. What is unique about Yata Israel is that we have this youth component, and it is really connecting different chapters, different young people from Turkey, Israel, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and creating this unique dialogue when we would usually not have the platform to talk about these issues. And with that said, I would like to mention that we have already started to organize short closed events, gathering young people, and we really aim and look forward to create this communication between different Yata chapters. And I invite all Yata chapters to contact us and to engage in cooperation with us. I would like to thank Stevie, who is the president of Yata Israel, Mr. Uri Ben Yaakov, who is leading Yata Israel, our partners at the Institute for Counter-Terrorism, ATA Israel, the Lauder School of Government Diplomacy and Strategy, and its dean, Professor Asaf Mugadam, and most importantly, our speakers, Mr. Townsend, our Ambassador Leshno-Yaar, Mr. Gabriele Cascone, Professor Boaz Ganor, Mr. Jenkins, Liram, and all of you who have joined us this evening. I wish you all a great rest of the day, and thank you very much for attending this event.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.